That was quite a lot of fun. And I think one of the things, well, as many of the students in this room know, I love a good extended metaphor, where you push and push and push as far as you can until it almost breaks, right? Like bias. So I have kind of a practical question. Maybe the way to put it is it's a pedagogy. Well, it seems like one of the things that you're aiming for in the exercises that you walked us through and that you have your students do involves a kind of creative revision of the imaginative processes by which we engage with the design world and the archive. And so I guess the question is, see if I can put it in a really concise way. How do we use these disruptive practices that you've kind of modeled for us, that are rooted in kind of creative thinking, effectively when we're confronted with an archive with its own bias, right? With its own kind of limiting, its contents might be limited, its structure might be limiting. And our very knowledge of how it got produced, the histories that it's telling are pretty limited. Like Dakota's point about how we, about how we relatively poorly understand the history of the technologies that those archives represent. So if we posit a new kind of metaphorical style of engagement with the archive, but we don't really know the archive very well, or we read it poorly. How do we confront that sort of problem, right? Thinking of ourselves as students of the archive, how do we confront our own limitations, our own biases, while also making space for this other way of engaging, right, which might be disruptive, whatever. If we don't have, a kind of, I don't know, a full understanding of a responsible relationship to the archive that is informed by kind of a deep knowledge of the history of technology or of labor, or some of the other things that create bias in the first place, then how do we compensate for that? Right? One way would be to disrupt or to interrogate our own assumptions and biases. But it does seem like there's another piece of it which might involve,
doing the work
differently. Yeah. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, so to start with, I can't claim legitimacy because I'm not a historian, but if I were, I think history has shown that that there are many folks that have been working to disrupt the sort of, as we have been using the canonical so often, but these sort of hegemonic modes of history making and historiography. And one intervention is around bias. I'm sorry, absence, particularly this notion of what does not exist, right? So these interventions of Ursa Fuentes and via Hartman and others have engaged very deeply with this notion that the absence is always a presence, always there, and it's whether the historian is actively engaged and working with, right, those absent moments. And so that I think in a sense there's that intervention happening already, or has been for compounding, and in many ways a necessary move, but there's also this other way in through the arts, through philosophy, and through maybe even a broad notion of the ethnographic, where you're kind of reimagine what it means to be a historian itself and the kind of methods we use. And that's where I find the making practice, whether you call it design or any kind of craft work, it's very much about also how we can infuse ourselves in a performance mode as well with what counts as an archive and how those stories get told and reenacted and re-engaged. So if that's an abstract answer, but if you're in the classroom, that is the script that I tend to follow. And it's very much because so many people have done it before me that that there's capacity to do almost both, the reimagining of methodology and just sort of engagement with absence, right?
Yeah, well, and it sounds like a lot of what you're up to involves rematerializing or re-engaging with the material in new ways. In a moment, I think it's safe to say when we all engage with archives, often at a remote distance, with that archives are being dematerialized right before our very eyes. I mean, when I invite students to go into the archive, I observe they often bring their kind of digital world biases in with them. How could they not, right? But treating the artifacts and the archive like data objects without being, fully cognizant of that. And which is not to say that I don't have my own biases too, but because I'm older, I have a different set of biases that I bring. So I'm just acutely aware of the fact that the efforts to find a new language for describing what we do with archives and then a new set of practices also requires us to be pretty thoughtful about, not, critical of our own assumptions and biases to begin with, which are, and bias by its own nature, by definition, is unconscious, right? I mean, often it's beyond our capacity to name it because we cannot conceive of it.
Well, there's this obsession with bias that, in fact, that's kind of what prompted this intervention, is that what is bias? Because because bias is sort of seen as the answer or the problem to be solved, it sort of also individuates a problem. So it ignores structural transformation as an issue. It's about sort of like, it's in you, just in your head. Let me fix you.
Right. Right.
But there's this wider notion of what we're talking about structural harm and violence. And so if we're really speaking about that, then you have to rethink the concept. So yeah.
Right. Well, all right. So I'll open it up and then see where the conversation takes us. Are there questions?
Hi, I was curious, in your definition of the word bias, do you see it as a tool for more investigation or as an obstacle? I wasn't fully sure.
Yeah. I mean, that's the tension, is which bias are we talking about? So as it's used, this sort of discourse is an obstacle in the sense that there's a lot of problematic meaning and hope thrown at this concept. But then as a reformulated and sort of retraced etymologically concept, so a material bias, I find it super productive as a tool. So thinking through this notion of bias, the material bias, is really productive in relation to this cultural bias or cognitive bias that we're just speaking to. Yeah.
There are many layers that you talked about that I'm still processing, but I have this, one of the things I was thinking about while you were talking was just materiality. How through design education moved away from that, and so like everything is digital now.
Yeah.
Even like, so we've lost some craft, right? Like,
Yeah.
once upon a time, you would ask students to print something out and mount it on that board and all the things. And
Yes.
we really, I don't, maybe it's a too general of a statement, but it's, so we don't really ask students to do a lot of that anymore. So I guess I'm curious just to hear your thoughts about how we've moved away from materiality in these other ways and how that maybe impacts the way students, I mean, when we hear the word archive, it's something bold, right? Like, how's that gonna help us, with our generate ideas or whatever, but, so I don't know.
Yeah, oh, so much there. Yeah, I mean, I do think it's to the detriment of our students that we don't do more of that, right? In the classroom, this whole kind of close the laptop, put away the digital, and really embrace sort of what we're talking about here in a embodied way. Whether that's like bringing more performance into the classroom and performativity, I feel like sort of in a really broad sense. And I had students last week sort of move their bodies to show what ChatGPT does, you know, like kind of like organize themselves. And it was a really beautiful configuration of the one student at the center kind of picking up on a gesture that each one did, so that the student turns out to have a dance background, which is awesome, because they were able to hold on to each gesture as they're learning it. And we talk about what that learning, if each piece, how it changes the other piece, right? It's not that you're learning one thing and then the next, it's actually that they're changing each other and shaping each other. So, and questions of ethics and come into play by necessity as well. So I just think it's so important that we do. And yet, yeah, there is a trend to continue to remove the material from the classroom. So that is something, yeah, I think it's a great opportunity. I'm sure many of you have examples, like something that you brought into the classroom that students, or maybe you yourself, were engaged with in a different way because it brought to mind different kinds of relationships and organization of what we take for granted. Yeah.
I'm quite struck by the fact that the archive, you said the archive is something old. But the archive is also a living concept in the minds of our students who bring in this, you know, the Pinterest board as an archive is a kind of new construct of an old thing, right? The drawers in a traditional library or archive collection, right? But that's not a relationship that our students are very good at thinking critically about necessarily, or even seeing that there's a kind of history to their own practice, you know, that they're bringing in. Maybe it's a bias as well.
But I think any database is an great, and we just use different language. So if you think about that, then there's a huge field of critical archival studies that has a lot to say to computer science.
Yeah.
And they're often very siloed. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really important connection to make with archive.
Well, I think that's it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.